Today we're going to go over a new concept called absolute value. So today's objective, we're going to take absolute value equations and solve them. So let's go over this idea of absolute value. We have in a number line, and on this number line we have different integers, and we know that there are different sides to the number line, all the numbers to the right of the zero and all the numbers to the left of the zero. So if we're moving from 0 and in the right direction, we have all the values that are positive. And if we take and move across the number line in the left direction, away from 0, we have all the integers that are negative. So we want to think about this number line and the distance certain numbers are away from 0 to understand absolute value. Absolute value just refers to how far away a number is from 0, or the distance away from 0. So for example, if I asked you to give me the absolute value of the number 5. So the notation is the 2 bars, and inside you write the number 5. So I would go ahead and find where 5 is. And I need to count or visualize how far is this number 5 from the 0. So I can either start from the 5 or start from the 0 and count the units between them. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The distance that 5 is away from 0 is 5. So the absolute value of 5 is 5. But the idea of absolute value refers to distance, so this positive and negative language is not relevant. For example, if I'm asking for the absolute value of negative 5, here's negative 5. I'm going to do the same thing and count for the distance away from 0. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Again, I have an answer of 5. So you notice that absolute value, the expression is always going to be positive. The distance that's being measured is always positive, regardless of whether the quantity inside the absolute value is positive or negative. The distance will always be positive. So let's take a look at solving equations. If I have the absolute value of x equals 7, what this equation is asking you to solve for is what integer or what number on the number line has a distance of 7. Well, when we just went over what absolute value was, we noticed that there were 2 positions on the number line that gave us a distance of 5. So in this question, we're looking for what are the 2 value points that would get us to a distance of 7 away from the 0. Well, the absolute value of x can be broken down into 2 different equations. One, x could be 7. We know that the number 7 is 7 units away from 0. But we also know that the value of x could also be negative 7, because negative 7 is going to be also 7 units away from the 0. So let's look at an equation that takes our variable expression and does some operations with them. So once again, we have this type of equation where everything is inside those absolute value signs. They're inside these bars. So we have k plus 2 equals 5. So we're asking ourselves that the value of whatever's inside the absolute value signs must have a distance of 5 from that 0. So we know that if we somehow get k plus 2 to equal 5, we know that it's going to be 5 units away from 0. But we also know that the other value that gives us a distance of 5 would be negative 5. So we know that k plus 2 must somehow equal -5. And once we have these two equations, we can go ahead and just solve them by applying inverse operations. So let's subtract 2 from both sides. So we have k equals 3. And on the other equation, we're both going to subtract 2 from both sides, and we get k equals -7. So what you notice is that we have two answers. The value k in this expression can be either the integer 3 or the integer -7. Both will give us an answer that gives us a distance or an absolute value of 5. Let's take a look at another type of equation where there's some parts of the expression on the outside of the absolute value sign. So we notice that there's this +6 on the outside. We can't touch anything inside the absolute value signs unless we make sure that everything on the outside is brought to the constant or expressions on the opposite sides. We want that absolute value expression to be all by itself. So how do we do that? We need to first subtract 6 on both sides so that we end up with the absolute value of p minus 5 equals 14. Once we get here, it's just another type of example where everything in our expression is inside the absolute value signs. So what this problem is asking us is, what value of p will give us a quantity that is 14 units away from 0, or an absolute value that is 14? Well, we know that if p minus 5 equals 14, then we're going to have a distance of 14. Or if we have p minus 5 equals -14, then we know that we also have a distance that is 14 units away. So once we have our two equations, we can then just go ahead and solve using inverse operations. So in this equation, we know that p could equal 19. Let's go ahead and look at the other equation. We also need to add 5. And in this equation, we have p can equal -9. So we have two answers, -9 and -19. Sorry, -9 and +19. Those are two answers. So let's go ahead and take a look at another example of an equation. Now this equation is a little tricky because I'm going to throw you a curveball. When you have an expression, for example, absolute value of h divided by -2 equals 4. Well, the first thing you want to ask yourself is every expression inside the absolute value signs, or are parts of it on the outside? And if you've located it, you see that there is a -2 on the outside. There's a -2 on the outside. And we want to get rid of it so that we have everything that is part of the absolute value signs on its own. So if we're dividing that absolute value expression by -2, we want to multiply it by -2. And when we do that, we get an answer of absolute value of h equals -8. But wait a minute. I remember saying that when we're working with absolute value and we're talking about distance away from 0, the units to measure that distance is always going to be positive. So there's no value that if we found for h that would give us a negative distance. So the answer to this problem is actually no solution. There is no possible integer that represents the value of h to get us a negative distance of -8. So this is a no solution. However, I just want you to remind yourselves that if you had solved this and got the absolute value of h equals 8, This is a totally different problem. You would then break this down into h can be positive 8 or h can be negative 8 because both the integer 8 and negative 8 will get you a distance of 8 units away from 0. Now here's a problem for you to practice all on your own. We have an equation 8 times the quantity or the absolute value of h plus 3 equals 16. Now you need to first ask yourself, are all the parts of the expression inside or outside the absolute value signs? If they're all inside, then go ahead and split them up into two separate equations, thinking about what are the two positions that share the same distance from 0 that would get us to the value we need. If parts of the equation are on the outside of that expression, you want to make sure that you solve it somehow by using inverse operations to make sure that only one side has that absolute value. Once you have done that, you can then figure out the answer to this expression. Good luck!